There's a moment in the life of every civilization when it makes a choice. Not the kind of choice written in treaties or debated in parliaments, but a quiet, collective, generational decision made deep inside the bones of a people. A decision that says, we see what you are building out there, and we want no part of it. Most civilizations eventually surrender to the pull of progress, absorbed into the grinding machinery of the modern world. But somewhere in the suffocating green darkness of the South Pacific, on an island that most people cannot find on a map without squinting, there is a community that made a different choice. And recently, by pure accident, the modern world finally caught a glimpse of them. What it saw changes everything we thought we understood about the edges of our own civilization. To understand what was captured on that camera, you first need to understand where it happened, because the geography of this place is not merely a backdrop. It is the entire story. Vanuatu is an archipelago of 83 islands scattered across the southwestern Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,500 kilometers east of Australia. The name itself translates roughly to land eternal in the local Bislama language, and that phrase carries a weight that you begin to feel the moment you look at satellite imagery of the place. From above, these islands look almost impossibly green, like emeralds flung carelessly into a blue ocean. But that serene appearance from space is deeply deceptive. Up close, Vanuatu is one of the most geologically violent, ecologically dense, and humanly complex places on the surface of the Earth. The islands were born from volcanic fury. Tectonic plates grinding against one another with tremendous force pushed massive walls of limestone and basalt straight up from the ocean floor, creating mountain ranges that are sheer, brutal, and almost completely vertical in places. The interior highlands of the larger islands, particularly Espiritu Santo in the north, rise to elevations above 1,800 meters. These peaks are perpetually wrapped in clouds and mist, receiving rainfall so consistently heavy that the forest beneath them operates in a state of permanent saturation. Leather rots in days. Metal rusts in hours. Trails carved through the undergrowth disappear within a week, swallowed by vegetation so aggressive it feels almost predatory. The canopy over these highlands is not a single layer of trees. It is a dense, stacked cathedral of plant life, with massive banyan trees forming the upper tier, their aerial root systems creating a lattice so thick and interlocking that they form a near-solid ceiling over the forest floor. Beneath them grow pandanus palms, wild ferns taller than a grown man, and thorny climbing vines that can shred exposed skin in seconds. The floor itself is a trap of honeycombed limestone, riddled with concealed sinkholes, subterranean rivers, and cave networks that extend for miles beneath the surface. This is not terrain that humans explore casually. This is terrain that actively resists exploration. And yet, people live here, have lived here for thousands of years, not clinging to survival in some desperate, primitive fashion, but thriving, with a sophistication and ecological mastery that modern outdoor science is only beginning to appreciate. Before we talk about the footage, we need to talk about custom, because without understanding custom, nothing else in this story makes sense. Custom is the word used across Vanuatu to describe the totality of traditional indigenous culture. But that description undersells it dramatically. Custom is not folklore or quaint custom. It is a complete and living governance system, a framework of law, spirituality, environmental management, social hierarchy, and land rights that predates European contact by thousands of years and continues to function as the primary legal authority for a significant portion of the Vanuatu population today. Under custom, the land is not a resource to be extracted or sold. It is a living entity with a history, a memory, and a set of obligations that flow in both directions between the people and the earth. Knowledge of the land, its medicinal plants, its hidden water sources, its seasonal cycles, belong specifically to those communities who have inherited that knowledge through bloodlines and ceremony. Outsiders are not merely unwelcome in the deep bush. Their presence represents a genuine violation of a sovereign legal system that has its own courts, its own punishments, and its own diplomacy. Vanuatu is also the most linguistically diverse nation on Earth when measured per capita. Over 100 distinct languages are spoken across its 83 islands, a fact that reflects the extraordinary degree of isolation that different communities maintained from one another over thousands of years. A river valley was a border, A mountain ridge was a wall. Two villages separated by an hour of walking might share no common language whatsoever and might regard each other with the same careful wariness that neighboring nations reserve for contested borders. This extreme cultural and linguistic fragmentation was not a failure of communication. It was the deliberate architecture of a society that understood the value of boundaries. The decision to remain hidden from the outside world was not made in a vacuum. It was forged across generations of documented catastrophe. Each wave of outside contact bringing something devastating enough to permanently reshape the survival strategy of the highland communities. The first catastrophic intrusion came in the form of blackbirding, a practice that operated primarily between the 1860s and the early 1900s. Ships flying British, Australian, and French flags would appear off the coastlines of what was then called the New Hebrides. Their crews used a combination of false promises, elaborate deception, and outright violent kidnapping to capture indigenous men and women from coastal villages. These people were then transported across the ocean in horrific conditions to work the sugarcane fields of Queensland in Australia and the cotton plantations of Samoa and Fiji. The scale of this trade was enormous. Tens of thousands of people taken from these islands, entire villages emptied in a single night. Those who survived the voyage rarely returned. The message delivered to every community watching from the hillsides was explicit and unforgettable. The coast is a killing ground, and the people who arrive by sea come to take what belongs to you. This lesson was reinforced almost immediately by a second catastrophe that proved even more devastating than physical abduction. European missionaries and traders who arrived on the islands brought diseases against which the indigenous population had absolutely no biological defense. Influenza, measles, tuberculosis, and dysentery swept through coastal communities with a speed and mortality rate that seemed supernatural to those experiencing it. In certain areas of the archipelago, population losses reached 90% within a generation. Entire knowledge systems were lost overnight when elders died before they could pass their oral histories to the young. The communities that survived were those that understood, through brutal experience, that physical distance from outsiders was the only reliable protection. The highland interior ceased to be merely a geographical feature and became a medical necessity, a quarantine zone maintained to preserve what remained of a people. Then came the Second World War, and Espiritu Santo in particular was transformed almost overnight into something the highland communities had no framework to comprehend. Beginning in 1942, the United States military converted the island into one of its most significant Pacific staging bases. Over 100,000 American soldiers, sailors, and support personnel descended on the island's northern coast. The jungle was cleared on an industrial scale. Airstrips capable of handling heavy bombers were carved out of the earth. The nights, which had been defined by the sounds of insects and wind and water, were suddenly replaced by the roar of aircraft engines, the grinding of bulldozers, and the distant concussions of weapons testing. For the people watching from the ridgelines, this was not a war they understood or had any stake in. It was simply irrefutable evidence that the world beyond their mountains had developed a capacity for destruction so far beyond anything in their experience that engagement with it was inconceivable. They climbed higher. They went deeper. They made the green curtain thicker. The footage was never supposed to exist. A geological survey team operating under contract to map volcanic fault systems and geothermal activity in the northern highlands of Espiritu Santo deployed a specialized mapping drone over the Cumberland Peninsula, a region of the island so remote and topographically hostile that it does not appear in any current anthropological survey as an area of active human habitation. The drone was equipped with multispectral imaging technology designed to penetrate dense vegetation and detect subsurface thermal signatures, essentially built to see through the jungle canopy and read what the earth is doing beneath it. The aircraft was operating at roughly 80 meters above a deep limestone ravine, a chasm so completely enclosed by overhanging banyan canopies that standard optical satellite imagery shows it simply as a flat, uniform surface of green. The drone's sensors were registering normal geological data when a brief electromagnetic disturbance caused the camera angle to shift. The operator on the ground adjusted the feed to check for equipment malfunction, and in doing so, caught something that no one on that team was prepared to process. For approximately 4 seconds, a gap in the canopy aligned with the camera's new angle to reveal a narrow stone ledge carved into the face of the ravine wall. Standing on that ledge was a man. His skin was darkened with what appeared to be a mixture of charcoal and ash, allowing him to blend almost perfectly with the dark basalt and shadow surrounding him. He was dressed in traditional clothing woven from bark fiber, and he held a longbow crafted from the dense, flexible wood of the black palm. He was not surprised. He was not frightened. He was watching the drone with the calm, focused attention of someone who has been trained since childhood to monitor threats from unexpected directions. His bow was held in a ready but relaxed position, an arrow nocked but not raised. He was assessing, not panicking. The thermal imaging data from the same moment revealed something equally significant. Behind the man, partially concealed within a cave opening in the ravine wall, heat signatures indicated a sustained fire source, the kind of consistent, controlled heat that speaks not to a temporary campsite, but to a permanent, occupied settlement using the natural cave system as living quarters and shelter. Within 3 seconds, a wind shift rotated the drone and disrupted the camera angle. When the feed stabilized and returned to the same coordinates, the ledge was completely empty. No movement visible, no displaced vegetation, no trace of transition. The man had simply ceased to be visible, absorbed back into the architecture of the rock and shadow as completely as if he had never existed. The footage set off a quiet but intense period of analysis among the small group of researchers and anthropologists who were permitted to view it. The physical and material details captured in those 4 seconds were extraordinarily rich for specialists trained to read them. The bow identified in the footage is consistent with craft traditions documented among several highland custom communities of northern Espiritu Santo, communities whose oral histories reference ancestral groups that retreated permanently into the interior during the colonial period and were never formally contacted or documented by government census authorities. The bark clothing and body modification practices visible in the footage align with cultural descriptions preserved in the accounts of early 20th century colonial administrators who noted encountering evidence of interior settlements without ever successfully locating or making contact with their inhabitants. The Vanuatu government's Cultural Preservation Office has for many decades acknowledged the theoretical existence of small, voluntarily isolated communities in the deep interior of several islands. These groups exist in a legal gray zone, not recognized as formal citizens, not subject to national law in any practical sense, and deliberately left undisturbed by a government that has generally understood the custom principle that some territories and some peoples simply do not wish to participate in the national project. Local guides and hunters from coastal villages on Espiritu Santo speak in careful, indirect terms about encountering signs of unseen presence in the highland bush, abandoned fire sites, deliberately broken trails, warning markers placed in ways that someone without cultural context would simply mistake for natural debris. The moment that footage was transferred from the drone storage to a laptop hard drive in a coastal research camp, a countdown began that the team recognized immediately and with considerable anxiety. The world we live in has a powerful, almost compulsive relationship with the undiscovered. We have built entire media ecosystems around the revelation of hidden things. An uncontacted community of humans living in a limestone ravine on a Pacific island would, if the footage were released publicly, generate a scale of attention that would make rational management of the situation essentially impossible. Documentarians, journalists, adventure tourists, and well-meaning but dangerous contact advocates would all begin moving toward the same coordinates. Each of them would carry their own invisible threat in the form of respiratory viruses, skin bacteria, and intestinal pathogens that their immune systems manage without difficulty, but that could devastate a population with zero exposure history. The historical record on this point is not ambiguous. Every documented case of first contact between isolated populations and modern societies has involved significant to catastrophic mortality from introduced disease, regardless of the intentions of those making contact. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented biological certainty. The immune naivety of a long-isolated population is not overcome by good intentions or careful hygiene protocols. The only reliable protection is distance. Beyond the immediate biological threat lies a deeper question that the modern world consistently fails to ask in good faith. Does a community of people have the right to remain unknown? We have constructed elaborate international frameworks protecting individual data privacy, the right to be forgotten in digital systems, the right to control the conditions under which personal information is shared. We extend these principles without serious debate to individuals navigating the digital economy. But when the question involves an entire community that has chosen, over many generations and at great cost, to remain outside the reach of global systems, we suddenly find that our commitment to respecting that choice becomes complicated by curiosity, by the economics of discovery, and by the deep-seated colonial assumption that integration with the modern world is always and automatically an improvement. The Vanuatu government's long-standing policy of non-interference with rumored interior communities reflects a more sophisticated understanding of this question than most national governments have managed to articulate. These communities are not administrative problems awaiting solutions. They are not populations in need of rescue from their own choices. They are sovereign human societies whose relationship with their land, their knowledge, and their way of life represents a form of cultural continuity stretching back further than most written civilizations. There is a temptation, when encountering evidence of a community living entirely outside the systems of modernity, to frame their situation as one of deprivation. They have no hospitals, no schools, no internet connection, no participation in a cash economy. By the metrics our civilization uses to measure human development, they register as invisible, uncounted, and therefore presumably disadvantaged. But this framing reveals far more about the assumptions embedded in our metrics than it reveals about the actual quality of life of the people being measured. A community that has sustained itself in one of the most ecologically demanding environments on Earth for thousands of years, without depleting its resources, without generating waste that outlasts its own generation, and without requiring the extraction of materials from anywhere beyond its immediate territory, has achieved something that modern industrial civilization is currently spending enormous resources trying to figure out how to do. Their agroforestry practices, their water management, their medicinal plant knowledge, their sustainable hunting protocols are not primitive approximations of modern science. They are fully developed, extensively tested, and demonstrably effective technologies that simply use different materials and operate at a different scale. The man standing on that ledge, watching the drone with calm analytical attention, was not a figure frozen in the past. He was a highly skilled, comprehensively educated member of a functional society, one whose education simply focused on a different curriculum than the one delivered in the world's universities. He knew things about that ravine, about the animals moving through it, about the plants growing from its walls, about the weather patterns flowing over it, that no outside researcher could acquire in years of fieldwork. That knowledge is neither quaint nor primitive. It is irreplaceable, and it exists nowhere else. The Geological Survey team made their decision after several days of intense private discussion. The coordinates of the ravine were not included in the public version of their survey report. The original video file was encrypted and placed in a secured private archive, accessible only to a small number of researchers bound by strict confidentiality agreements. The official report noted an electromagnetic anomaly in the sector and moved on. It was a deliberate act of protective omission in a world that regards omission as a kind of crime against transparency. But the team understood something that our culture of radical disclosure often forgets. Not all knowledge needs to be shared, and the decision about whether to share certain knowledge carries real moral weight. The question is not whether we have the technical capability to locate, document, and publicize the existence of this community. We clearly do. The question is whether doing so would make the world better or worse, for them and ultimately for all of us. The mist that permanently shrouds the high peaks of Espiritu Santo is, in this light, not merely a meteorological phenomenon. It is a kind of natural moral argument, a reminder that the world contains boundaries that deserve respect not because they are enforced by law or defended by armies, but because the act of crossing them without permission causes harm. The hunter in the ravine has not asked to be found. He has not asked to be documented, analyzed, or included in anyone's understanding of human diversity. His sovereignty over his own life and community is not diminished by the fact that a drone briefly interrupted his afternoon. The last living uncontacted frontiers on this earth are not relics of an incomplete history. They are active, ongoing proof that human life is richer and more various than any single civilization's model can contain. Protecting them requires us to practice something genuinely difficult: the willingness to leave a question unanswered, to roll up the cameras, to accept that some places on the map are better left blank, and to find in that blankness not a failure of knowledge, but a success of wisdom. The smoke from that subterranean fire is still rising through the limestone vents of the Cumberland Range. The oral histories are still being chanted beneath the banyan canopy, and the man with the black palm bough is still watching the sky with calm, patient eyes, entirely indifferent to our need to know him. That indifference is not ignorance. It is a choice, and it deserves our deepest respect.